Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take really complex topics, loads of research, academic papers, policy stuff, and basically break it all down so you get the key insights found.
Yeah, make it make sense.
Exactly. And today, we've got quite a stack. It's a deep body of work looking at the American political landscape. Our mission, and it's a big one, is to perform, well, let's call it a comprehensive ideological autopsy on the American left.
Autopsy is a strong word, but yeah, we need to trace the lineage.
Right. We need to track its journey from its, high-minded beginnings and Enlightenment thinking through all those huge changes in the 20th century.
Huge changes.
And get right up to the specific fights and polarization points that, well, define things today. It's a deep dive into the family tree of modern political conflict, really.
And it's crucial because the left today, it signifies something so different than it did, say, 150 years ago. Totally different animal. So our goal is to dissect those key moments, intellectual shifts, social movements, economic pressures that drove that evolution. We really have to navigate these two powerful, sometimes clashing American ideals. That classic idea of individual freedom, property rights.
The lock-in stuff.
Exactly. Versus the, let's call it, progressive push for collective equity, social justice. The friction point between those two. That's kind of the key to understanding right now.
Okay, so before we dive headfirst into Locke and Rousseau, maybe we just quickly touch on the sources themselves. They're pretty varied, right?
They are multifaceted, yeah.
Yeah.
Some of the analysis, especially when it critiques more recent political trends, draws from people with backgrounds that mix security and academic fields. Sean Armstrong is mentioned in the materials, for example.
Right, Armstrong. And his background is pretty interesting.
It is. The sources note he's got, a solid academic foundation, degrees in criminal justice, then a BA and a graduate diploma in Homeland Security and Counterterrorism from the Naval Postgraduate Program, plus specialized military emergency management training.
So, quite practical.
Very practical, and his published work reflects that range, things like tactical training with firearms, but also more philosophical stuff like Warrior's Path on Karate Philosophy. But the material we're focusing on today uses that kind of analytical skill to map out the theoretical path of political thought in the U.S. It's primarily about the political theory.
Got it. Okay, let's unpack this huge history then, starting right at the beginning, the big break from the old ways. So when we talk about the foundation, classical liberalism, it was genuinely revolutionary for its time, wasn't it? It wasn't about big government at all, quite the opposite.
Oh, absolutely revolutionary. It emerged straight out of the Enlightenment. It was conceived as like an intellectual shield against despotism, right? Against kings, feudal lords, the whole divine right thing.
Exactly.
Thinkers like Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, they laid down the core ideas. Individual rights are sacred, personal freedoms, rule of law, and crucially, government power must be strictly limited. Its main job. Protect those individual liberties, not define them, not hand out welfare.
So the ideal state back then was pretty hands-off. Let free markets run, let individuals run their own lives. So where does the pivot start? How does this limited government idea begin to, embrace more government?
Well, the sources really point to industrialization as the catalyst. Classical liberalism's free markets. They created enormous wealth, sure, but they also created staggering inequality, terrible working conditions, these wild boom and bust cycles that just wrecked people's lives.
Yeah.
So critics started popping up, arguing that just focusing on individual freedom ended up meaning freedom for the powerful to exploit everyone else. And that's where modern liberalism starts to take shape-shifting away from pure individualism towards something more collective, prioritizing, social justice, collective well-being.
And right away, the classical liberals got worried.
Yeah.
What was the big fear about giving government this bigger role?
Governmental overreach. Simple as that. The fear was that the state, even if it had good intentions like fighting for social justice, would just keep grabbing power and individual liberty would get squeezed out. The sources bring up this idea of soft despotism from Tocqueville. It's not tyranny by a dictator, but this slow creep of rules, regulations, bureaucracy, until citizens just sort of lose the ability to think and act for themselves. It just kind of smothers you.
And this tension really blew up politically during the Progressive era. Woodrow Wilson was a key figure here, right, between 1913 and 1921. What was his main contribution to this shift?
Wilson basically looked at the modern industrial economy, huge factories, railroads, big finance, and said, the 18th century limited government model just doesn't cut it anymore. His progressive view is that if capitalism runs wild, you get these massive trusts, monopolies concentrating power.
Right, the robber barons.
Exactly, and that corrodes the whole society. So he argued the government actually had a duty, both moral and practical, to step in, manage the economy, ensure some level of fairness and real competition.
And he wasn't just talking, he put major changes into place. What kind of structures did he build?
Oh, his administration was pivotal. Huge changes. You got the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 creating a central bank to try and smooth out those crazy economic swings of the laissez-faire days. Plus, he went hard after trusts with antitrust laws. These weren't small tweaks. They were fundamental changes saying, look, the federal government is now the main manager, the main regulator of the national economy.
So the tension is crystal clear there. Progressivism wanted collective good economic fairness. But the critics are shouting, you're giving the state immense power. This could lead straight back to despotism.
That's the irony that just keeps playing out, isn't it? Every step towards more collective equity seems to involve boosting state power, which immediately triggers that old classical liberal fear of centralized control. But that fear got kind of pushed aside by, well, catastrophe in the 1930s.
Right, the Great Depression, it just flattened the whole minimal government idea. FDR had to do something drastic. And this is where the sources talk about quantitative liberalism. That term itself is really interesting. What's it mean?
Quantitative liberalism, yeah. It marks this moment where the left becomes really pragmatic, data-obsessed, almost technocratic. The failures of the early 30s were so bad, ideological purity took a backseat to just results. What works?
Numbers.
Numbers. FDR's team started using statistics for everything.
Yeah.
Tracking unemployment, measuring poverty levels, seeing if federal programs were actually doing anything. Policy decisions started getting justified by data points. How many jobs created, how many farms saved, what's the GDP doing? It was like governance by spreadsheet.
And you can't do that without a massive government machine. Right. That had to mean a huge explosion in bureaucracy.
Oh, unprecedented. The New Deal scope was just breathtaking.
Right.
And they reframed social help. It wasn't charity anymore. It was presented as a basic right of citizenship. That fundamentally changed how people saw the state.
Yeah, Social Security.
Exactly. But to run all these programs, the federal government just ballooned. Federal spending almost doubled in just 4 years, like $5 billion in 32 to over $9 billion by 36.
Right.
And by 1940, something like 40 new agencies had popped up. WPA, CCC, SEC, the alphabet soup.
So where did the pushback focus? What were the immediate criticisms of this huge New Deal apparatus?
A lot of it centered on this idea of technocratic elitism, and again, the risk of soft despotism. The argument was, you've got this massive bureaucracy run by unelected experts, the technocrats who are making decisions based on data, maybe efficiently, but totally disconnected from the people on the ground.
Right. Decisions made far away.
Yeah. And critics feared that even if the intentions were good, this constant expansion of government managing every little thing just leads straight to that soft despotism where individual choices and local needs get steamrolled and people become politically passive. #tag2, post-war philosophy and the rise of radical roots.
Okay, so America comes out of the Depression, wins World War II, and the ideological heat cools down a bit. The sources call this the liberal consensus. What was that period like right after the war?
Yeah, for a while there, roughly late 40s through the early 60s, there was pretty broad agreement across the political spectrum. Most people accepted that government had a role in keeping the economy stable, pushing for civil rights, maintaining a decent social safety net.
What held that consensus together?
Partly it was belief in the American system after winning the war, the post-war boom. But a big part was external too, the Cold War. There was this strategic need for social unity to stand against communism. We had to look cohesive.
But even during this time of, peak American prosperity, the sources say liberal leaders started questioning, the quality of that prosperity. This led to something called qualitative liberalism. What was that critique about?
The critique was about consumerism, basically. The post-war boom created this incredibly affluent society, but it was also becoming really materialistic. People were just focused on buying stuff.
Keeping up with the Joneses.
Exactly. And a lot of liberal thinkers and politicians felt this was hollowing out civic virtue, moral purpose. So qualitative liberalism tried to shift the focus. It prioritized things like the quality of life, civic participation, moral progress, not just how much stuff we were producing, not just GDP numbers.
And that's where JFK's famous line comes in. Ask not what your country can do for you. That was hitting right at that consumer entitlement idea.
Precisely. That wasn't just a nice patriotic phrase. It was an ideological challenge. He was telling Americans, stop just thinking about what you can get from the government, focus on your responsibilities to the collective. It was a call for national purpose over just individual gain.
And then LBJ's Great Society tried to really build on that qualitative idea,
Right.
like going beyond just economics to tackle deeper social and moral problems.
Right. Johnson's programs obviously aimed at poverty and racial injustice, huge moral issues. But he also put a big focus on things like environmental protection,
Mhm.
Water Quality Act, the Air Quality Act. These were framed as moral issues, too.
Not just economic efficiency.
No. The argument was you can't measure real progress just by factories and wealth. You have to look at the dignity of your people, the health of the land and air. It was trying to shift the definition of national success from quantity to quality to moral responsibility.
Okay, but even with these big legislative wins, like the Civil Rights Act of '64, Voting Rights Act of '65, that wasn't enough for everyone. This is when we see that radical split, especially with the rise of the Black Power movement. Where did they say mainstream liberalism was failing?
Mainstream liberalism, for all its legal victories, was seen by these emerging radical groups as, well, too shallow. Black power activists, coming up in the late 60s, argued that getting the right to vote or sit at a lunch counter didn't mean much if economic power, cultural institutions, all that stuff stayed firmly in white control.
So they wanted deeper change.
Much deeper. They emphasized self-determination, racial pride, building economic power within Black communities. It was about systemic change, not just tweaking the existing system.
Can you give an example of how they tried to put that vision into practice?
Well, the Black Panther Party is a prime example. They didn't just do political lobbying. They set up actual community programs, free breakfast for kids, health clinics, educational initiatives.
Real on-the-ground stuff.
Yeah, designed to provide immediate help, but also, crucially, to build independent Black institutions. That was the goal. Create power bases outside the mainstream structures. That's a fundamentally different approach than just asking for policy changes.
And this definitely created tension within the Black community itself. The sources mention this split between the so-called Black bourgeoisie and the more radical voices.
Oh yeah, that was a sharp ideological divide. The Black bourgeoisie, generally speaking, focused on integration, using the existing legal and political system to achieve equality. The goal was often assimilation into the broader American success story.
Climbing the ladder.
Right. Whereas radical voices, like Malcolm X, especially in his later phase, were deeply critical of that. They saw it as potentially prioritizing individual success over collective liberation, maybe even as a kind of ideological surrender.
Yeah.
Malcolm X pushed for radical self-reliance, cultural separation if necessary, until genuine economic and political parity was achieved.
These political shifts didn't happen in a vacuum. There were big philosophical currents feeding into this. How did something like existentialism influence the radical left?
Existentialism, particularly thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, offered a really powerful intellectual tool for radical activists. They blew up the classical liberal idea that your identity is defined by some abstract universal rights or fixed social roles.
How so?
Their core idea was existence precedes essence. You aren't born with a fixed nature or purpose. You are radically free, and you have to create your own meaning through your choices, your actions. For activists, this translated directly into the idea that liberation couldn't just be handed down through policy reforms by elites.
It had to be seized.
Exactly. It had to be authentic, forged through struggle by the oppressed individuals and groups themselves. They had to define what freedom meant for them. It wasn't just about getting rights, it was about achieving genuine self-creation.
And this connects to C. Wright Mills and his idea of the sociological imagination. That became huge for radical sociology, didn't it? What was his big insight?
Mill's genius was connecting personal problems to larger public issues. The sociological imagination is basically the ability to see the link between your own private life, like, say, losing your job, and the big impersonal social forces shaping society, like economic policies or corporate decisions.
So it's not just your fault.
Right. It helps you see that maybe your unemployment isn't just a personal failing, but part of a larger pattern, a systemic issue. And Mills was scathing about the concentration of power among what he called the power elite, the top figures in politics, the economy, the military. He argued they rigged the system for themselves. This framework gave radicals a powerful way to analyze and critique systemic oppression. Hashtag THAD3. Institutionalizing radicalism and the neoliberal countershift.
Okay, so these radical ideas born in the 60s, they didn't just stay in books or manifestos. They flowed right into institutions, especially universities. Yeah. The student New Left really took hold.
Oh, absolutely. Groups like SDS Students for a Democratic Society and the Free Speech Movement at Berkeley back in '64, they weren't just asking for curriculum changes. They were challenging the whole structure of authority in the university, demanding what they called participatory democracy.
And they actually changed things. How did they reshape academia?
Profoundly. Their demands for inclusion, for relevance, led to a fundamental shakeup of what was taught and how. You saw the creation of whole new fields: women's studies, African American studies, Chicano studies, ethnic studies programs.
Wow.
This shifted the academic focus, pulling it away from exclusively Eurocentric perspectives and pushing it towards critical analysis of identity, power structures, the experiences of marginalized groups. The curriculum itself became a key site of ideological struggle and transformation.
This whole strategy changing institutions from the inside brings us to a really key concept for understanding the modern left. Antonio Gramsci's Long March theory. It gets thrown around a lot, but what did he actually argue?
Gramsci was an Italian Marxist writing from prison under Mussolini back in the 20s and 30s. He was trying to figure out why Marxist revolutions hadn't happened in Western democracies. His big insight was that in the West, the state wasn't just ruling through force, through the police and army, what he called domination.
Okay.
It was ruling through consent, through what he called hegemony. Hegemony is basically the set of dominant ideas, values, norms disseminated through institutions like schools, the media, churches, even pop culture that make the existing social order seem natural, inevitable, just common sense.
People kind of accept the system without being forced to.
Exactly. They internalize the ruling ideas. So Gramsci said a frontal assault, a war of maneuver wouldn't work. You needed a war of position, a long, slow struggle within the cultural institutions themselves.
A long march through the institutions.
That's the phrase often used, yeah. The idea is for radicals, guided by what he called organic intellectuals, people who bridge grassroots movements and intellectual work to gradually infiltrate and transform these cultural sites, chip away at the dominant hegemony, build a counter-hegemony, change the common sense of society.
And our sources say this strategy has actually been influential in the U.S. Where do they point to examples?
The sources trace its influence in various areas. They suggest elements can be seen even in how the New Deal expanded the scope of government responsibility, shifting cultural norms about the state's role. More clearly, you see it in the feminist movement's success in embedding changes like Title IX.
Right. Affecting education and sports profoundly.
And pushing affirmative action policies into institutions. And more recently, groups like Black Lives Matter have been cited as effectively using this strategy, leveraging existing institutional platforms, media, corporations, foundations, local government, while also mobilizing street-level action. It's about working both inside and outside.
It's a long-term strategy, changing the culture to eventually change the politics. But here's the whiplash moment. Just as these radical ideas are digging into universities and culture, the whole economic philosophy of the country takes a sharp right turn towards neoliberalism. How did that happen? How did those two things coexist?
It's one of the great paradoxes of the late 20th century, isn't it? Neoliberalism, pushed by thinkers like Hayek and especially Milton Friedman, was all about deregulation, privatization, cutting taxes, trusting the free market. Friedman famously argued that government intervention was the biggest threat to freedom and prosperity.
So why did elites in both parties supposedly buy into this? The sources talk about a neoliberal consensus.
Well, the consensus really grew out of disillusionment. That strong post-war faith in big government, the New Deal Great Society model, kind of crumbled. You had the Vietnam War disaster, Watergate shattering trust in government, plus the economic mess of the 1970s, stagflation, which seemed to show that government economic planning wasn't working. So by the 80s and 90s, elites across the political spectrum, including many leading Democrats, started seeing market-based solutions, not government programs, as the best way to get economic growth.
So, ironically, the failure of faith in the state opened the door for the ascendancy of the market.
In a way, yes. This consensus drove policies like major tax cuts, deregulation, especially finance, embracing globalization, and generally favoring large corporations. So while parts of the left were winning cultural battles in academia, the economic policy landscape was shifting dramatically in the opposite direction, toward market fundamentalism. And critics argue this neoliberal shift, whatever its intentions, ended up dramatically worsening economic inequality.
Okay, this winding path brings us right up to the present day. And the core conflict now seems really centered on identity and how that interacts with or clashes with those older universal liberal principles. Let's try to define identity politics clearly first, because that term gets used in a lot of ways.
Right. Academically speaking, identity politics usually refers to political organizing and positions based on shared group characteristics: race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, disability, and so on. The idea is to address the specific ways different groups experience marginalization, ways that broad, universal policies might miss.
And intersectionality fits in here.
Exactly. Intersectionality is a key concept within identity politics. It argues that these different categories, race, class, gender, etc., don't operate in isolation. They overlap and interact, creating unique and often compounding forms of discrimination or privilege. So movements like Black Lives Matter, focusing on anti-Black racism, or Me Too, focusing on sexual harassment and assault against women, are major contemporary examples.
Now, this focus on group identity, while aiming to help marginalized groups, has faced some really strong critiques. What's the main worry critics raise about prioritizing identity over universalism?
The big critique, often coming from within the broader left too, is the risk of fragmentation. The concern is that if you focus too much on what makes each group's experience of oppression unique, you can end up undermining solidarity across groups.
Pitting groups against each other.
Potentially, or at least making it harder to build broad coalitions. It can clash with the classical liberal ideal of universalism, the idea that everyone shares fundamental human rights and dignity regardless of their group identity. Critics worry this focus on difference erodes the common ground needed for collective action.
And there's this related critique about binary thinking, that it simplifies things too much.
Yeah, binary thinking is this tendency, especially in really heated debates around identity, to divide the world into simple opposing camps: oppressor versus oppressed, victim versus perpetrator, good versus evil. While that might seem clarifying sometimes, critics argue it shuts down nuance. Well, it makes it hard to see complexity, gray areas, internal differences within groups, or the possibility of people holding multiple identities. It can frame every interaction as inherently adversarial, which makes dialogue, compromise, and building bridges across different groups really difficult. It can harm social cohesion.
Okay, and this clash between protecting specific group identities and upholding universal individual rights really comes to a head in the debate over free speech versus censorship. This seems like a direct challenge to the foundational American ideas.
It absolutely is. The classical liberal tradition is deeply committed to the idea of a free marketplace of ideas. You let all ideas compete, even the ones you find offensive or wrong, and truth will eventually win out. Or at least people have the right to express them.
But the modern argument is different.
The modern argument, often coming from an identity politics perspective, emphasizes harm. It argues that certain kinds of speech aren't just offensive, they actually inflict real harm on marginalized groups, creating hostile environments, reinforcing oppression. Therefore, protecting these groups requires limiting or suppressing that harmful speech. Critics call this trend illiberal democracy. You have elections, but the core liberal values, like free expression, are eroding.
The sources give a really concrete example of this tension involving Robert Reich and Elon Musk.
Right. That was a high-profile instance where Robert Reich, a prominent political economist, suggested that someone like Elon Musk should potentially face legal consequences, even arrest, for using his platform to spread what Reich considered dangerous lies and hate speech.
That's a pretty radical position from a free speech standpoint.
It is. It fundamentally challenges the classical liberal view. It says some speech crosses a line from expression into harmful action, and the state might need to step in. It's the idea that the potential damage caused by certain speech outweighs the principle of absolute free expression.
And the counterargument from the classical liberal side is that this opens the door to authoritarianism.
Precisely. The critics worry that once you start deciding which speech is too dangerous to allow, you're on a slippery slope. Who decides what's dangerous? Who gets to control the discourse? They argue that pushing for ideological purity tests, silencing dissent, using institutional or even legal power to shut down opposing views, well, that starts to look a lot like the tactics used by authoritarian regimes.
The fear is soft despotism again, but maybe not so soft.
Yeah, the fear is that even with good intentions protecting people from harm, you end up creating a climate of fear, self-censorship, where people are afraid to speak their minds, and that ultimately kills the open debate democracy needs.
Okay, lastly, we need to address the very difficult topic of political violence. And just to be clear up front, we are strictly reporting the information and specific incidents cited in the source material, maintaining complete impartiality. The sources do try to contextualize this first.
Yes, that's important. The sources note that research generally shows most Americans reject political violence. Data cited suggests only about 10% support using violence for political aims, which is very different from the 65% who accept violence in self-defense, so it's a minority view.
Right.
However, the sources then go on to detail specific documented incidents from 2021 to 2023 that they attribute to elements associated with the left, forcing these within the context of rising ideological conflict and radicalization.
Let's go through those specific incidents as reported. What happened in January 2021, according to the sources?
The sources describe incidents involving individuals identified as Antifa and BLM activists. One example cited is an alleged attack on Senator Josh Hawley's home, where protesters reportedly gathered, threatened his wife and child, linked directly to his political stance on election certification.
Okay.
They also mention reports of assaults and clashes in Washington, D.C. during protests around the election results, specifically citing confrontations between anti-family activists and Trump supporters.
And the sources also focus on recurring issues in places like Portland.
Yes, Portland features heavily. The sources cite repeated incidents involving individuals identified as Antifa, including sustained attacks on police buildings and federal courthouses, sometimes involving arson, and direct clashes with DHS agents.
Were individuals named?
Yes, specific cases are mentioned. For instance, the sources highlight Malik Fard Mohammed, described as an Antifa member, who faced serious charges, including attempted murder, related to these violent confrontations in Portland.
The sources also mention attacks on journalists covering these events.
That's correct. The case of Andine Go is cited, describing a violent assault allegedly by Antifa members while he was reporting on their activities in Portland in May 2021, which resulted in significant injuries. This is presented as an example of targeting those documenting the movement.
And political candidates facing harassment, too.
Yes, the sources describe an incident involving Larry Elder during his California gubernatorial campaign. He was reportedly assaulted people throwing eggs, physical harassment, and an attack later investigated as a racially motivated hate crime by the LA County Sheriff's Office, according to the sources.
Moving into 2023, there was a significant incident related to the Stop Cop City protests in Atlanta.
Right. The sources detail the death of Manuel Esteban Paez-Terran, identified as an Antifa protester. He was killed by law enforcement in January 2023 after allegedly shooting and wounding a state trooper during an operation to clear the protest site. His death sparked further protests in Atlanta, some of which involved vandalism and arson, as reported in the sources.
And finally, the sources touch on incidents related to transgender activism, including the Nashville shooting.
Yes, the sources mention incidents like a protest at the Oklahoma State Capitol against bans on gender transition treatments, where an activist reportedly threw water on and struck a state representative. This section also covers the tragic Nashville school shooting committed by Audrey Hale, identified as a transgender woman who killed 6 people.
How did the sources frame the reaction to that?
They note the political division in the aftermath, with some critics blaming Republican gun policies, while others pointed towards the shooter's reported mental health struggles and potential ideological motivations.
And the sources wrap up this section with a broader concern about education.
Yeah, a concern about what they term ideological indoctrination in some educational contexts. The sources draw a comparison to military conditioning, emphasizing structure, repetition of specific ideas, demanding conformity, and argue this approach can stifle critical thinking and intellectual diversity. They suggest this could potentially contribute to negative outcomes, including a greater acceptance of political violence. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. Okay, that was quite a journey through American ideological history. We started way back with the Enlightenment bedrock individual liberty above all, then tracked through FDR's very pragmatic, number-crunching, quantitative liberalism. We looked at the huge philosophical challenge from the radicals in the 60s, Gramsci's idea of the long march through institutions, and then that jarring economic U-turn with the neoliberal consensus.
Big shifts.
And we ended up right here in today's landscape, shaped by identity politics, really fierce battles over free speech, and these disturbing examples of political violence that the sources document.
And if you look at that whole arc, as laid out in these materials, the story of the American left seems defined by this constant fundamental tension. It's a struggle to square the classical liberal promise of individual freedom and a pluralistic society with the progressive drive for her collective equity, for systemic justice.
The 2 core ideals we started with.
Exactly. And the sources suggest, historically, the real flashpoint happens when that intense push for justice starts to feel like it's replacing open debate and tolerance for different views with, well, dogmatic purity and control, which ironically is the very kind of soft despotism those early liberals were trying to prevent.
So, reflecting on all this history, this complex evolution, what's the takeaway for you, the listener, trying to navigate today's polarized world? Here's our final thought to leave you with.
Considering this historical pattern where concentrated power, even power used for supposedly good ends, tends to chip away at liberty. How do we, as active citizens in a democracy, push for necessary systemic reforms, push for greater justice, without accidentally shutting down the very individual freedoms like free speech, like diversity of thought, that a truly functioning and ultimately a truly just society actually depends on?